Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Ruth.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. I don't remember who assigned it to me, but I had to read a book somewhere when I was in school called El Amor en los Tiempos de Cólera. Love in the Time of Cholera. It's by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I think a Colombian author. I don't remember everything about the story other than it's a very complex love story about a tension not just between people, but it's also about a tension between eras. This romantic era of yore, maybe set in the 19th century and looking backwards, coming into conflict with a new era, the era of modernity and progress. And as you can tell by the very compelling title, it's a story about very complicated love in very difficult times. This beautiful thing set against the backdrop of this very ugly thing. And that's kind of what you get with Ruth, except I like the love story more in Ruth. The opening line of the book of Ruth is, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man," and it goes on to talk about some plot stuff we're going to talk about here in just a minute, but it sets it in the age of the judges. Were you here yesterday when we talked about the judges? If you were, you might remember that was not a happy time. It was worse than cholera. I don't know. I've never had cholera. I'm guessing it was worse than cholera. You're talking about north of 300 years that book of Judges covers, and it's all nightmare. The characters who give us any hope or get anything even remotely right would be far and away the worst characters in any other era of ever. The only reason they even kind of come off as useful is because they're being contrasted with the even horribler people and even horribler setting of this amoral, debased, wretched age. And it's depressing to work through the book of Judges. You get only the slightest glimmer of hope at the end when, in the midst of a very condemnatory statement about society in this moment, it says, "In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit in their own eyes." But that word king suggests that there might be an answer to this depravity, this disease that had deeply infected the heart of all people of all time, but particularly people here in the age of the judges. And maybe some kind of hope could come from real leadership, lasting leadership. And so that's what's teased to us as a possible solution at the end of Judges. But now we're reading Ruth, and right off the bat, we're told that this isn't happening after the era we just read about in Judges. This is love in the time of cholera. This is all happening during the dark time. But despite being set in the era of the Judges, Ruth feels different than Judges. Right off the bat, we meet a family going through a hard time, and they seem okay. There's a famine in the land. And so this family from Bethlehem in Judah, so Israelites, they go to Moab, the ancient enemies of the Israelite people. Remember, the Moabites were resistant to letting the Israelites pass through their turf when they were trying to get into Canaan way back in the day. So it's not a great relationship, but they go to Moab of all places. And there, this family, a dude, his two sons and his wife, they find love. The two sons marry Moabite women, and then tragedy strikes again. It is the era of the judges, and all the men in the family die. So now we got a weird situation. We're stuck in Moab, a foreign country. We have an Israelite mom from Bethlehem, and she's got two daughters-in-law. What are you going to do with them? Well, she's like, I guess I just got to go home. That's my only option. One daughter-in-law is like, okay, well, I'd better stay put. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, is like, no way, I'm going with you. Wherever you go, I'm going there. Whatever's your land, that's going to be my land too. Your people, my people, your God, my God. I'm with you, Mom. And it's amazing. It's so refreshing. After everything we've been through in Judges, here is character and decency and loyalty. And there's hope in that, and it's refreshing. And so the first scene in the book of Ruth ends with these two unlikely traveling companions, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, going back to Bethlehem to see what might happen. Scene number 2 happens as they arrive during the barley harvest. And there, Ruth goes out to glean in a field. According to some of the civil law that is back from the books of Moses that we looked at a while back, there were certain provisions for impoverished people, for widows, that they could go and glean a little percentage of what was left behind when a harvest was happening. It was like a built-in form of social welfare. And so Ruth goes out to glean in this particular barley field. And whose field is it? Well, it turns out it's a family member from Naomi's side of the family named Boaz. And we quickly find out that he is also decent. What in the world? We've met like 3 good people in a row after meeting roughly 0 for 20 plus chapters in the era of the Judges in the last book. And he's like, hey, all you make sure that you actually leave behind enough grain for this lady to collect it and don't mess with her. That's awesome. Well, between scene 2 and scene 3 of this story, we discover that Boaz isn't just a family member of Naomi. He is positioned to be the kinsman redeemer for Naomi's family. This is a complicated idea. We don't have a neat analog of this in modern society, but back then, the fortunes of a family had to do with producing heirs and keeping property and livestock within that family. It's why you get the pickiness about intermarriage and so forth with the Canaanites back in Joshua and the Pentateuch. It's not some kind of racial superiority thing. It's really until very, very recently in the era of marrying for love, this is how title and land and ownership and generational growth as a family occurred. And it was by bloodlines. And so this stuff was really important. And whose kid was actually whose kid was really important as well. And we got to remember that when we look at a lot of the sexual, family, parentage, property rules that existed in ancient times, like what we're getting here in Ruth. Well, there was this cultural practice that existed by which the nearest relative of a family member who had experienced a tragedy like what Naomi and Ruth had experienced would engage in some sort of marriage. Now, my impression is, for a lot of the time back here, this would not result in literal plural marriage. If somebody was already married and they were a kinsman redeemer, they would just effectively take responsibility for the household that was abandoned or orphaned or whatever you want to call it, widowed, and would rope their estate into the family estate again to make sure that that land was not lost and to make sure that everybody who was on their own was no longer on their own and was provided for. But if somebody wasn't married at all, they could just straight up marry a widow left behind by someone in their family who had died. In other words, this kinsman redeemer thing is about taking what looks like total despair and flipping it around to something that has hope. So it would be very easy for you and I as modern readers to listen to this unfold between scene 2 and scene 3 of Ruth and be like, ooh, that sounds icky and gross. But if we think of it in light of how the original audience would have heard it, they would have seen the beauty in this. They would have seen wow, that's amazing that this is all coming together the way it is. There's a real chance things are going to work out for these 2 ladies, that they will get justice, that they will get care, that things will be all right for them. Well, what's going to happen next? In scene 3, Naomi's like, look, hey, you got to quit acting like you're a woman in mourning, and you have to find a way that makes cultural sense in this era in Bethlehem to communicate to Boaz that you are available. And there's this very tender scene with some kind of tradition that I don't understand, where she goes to him in the night. It looks like there are a lot of people there all kind of crashed out sleeping. And she's there, and essentially the invitation is, would you extend like the end of your garment, the end of your blanket, if you will, over part of me? And I've heard some people suggest that this is a euphemism for some sort of act of physical intimacy. I suppose it could be, but because that physical intimacy seems to happen a little bit later on in the story after they are actually married, spoilers, I tend to think that this is some sort of symbolic gesture, this whole laying at his feet and being received by him in this way. The 4th scene has Boaz going out to the city where the business happens, and like you got to give notice in the paper back in the day in the legal section. You remember those? It's almost like that happens at the city gates. And Boaz is like, hey, I'm going to marry Ruth and redeem this part of my family on behalf of my deceased family members, as long as that makes sense to everybody. Well, it turns out there's somebody who is a little more closely related, and they talk about it. And the guy's like, well, I probably ought to do the redeeming then. But then when he realizes that it's not just a property deal, but you're also going to be marrying this lady, for whatever reason, that did not work for his current situation, and it made more sense for Boaz to do the redeeming, which means that God was faithful, and it means that something beautiful happened against this horrible, hopeless backdrop. It means that something came out of what looks like basically nothing to create something beautiful. But in the final little epilogue, we discover that it's not just something beautiful for these people, but there's a hint that it's something beautiful for maybe more, maybe everybody, because we learn that the little baby that comes from Ruth and Boaz is named Obed, and we learn in the final phrase of Ruth that Obed fathered a man named Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. Now, the text doesn't use the word king there because it assumes the original audience would know exactly that David was a king, but I drop that bonus descriptor of David because, look at this. Judges ends with the term king as the slight little glimmer of hope. It's going to take something like this to get things straightened out. And Ruth is ending on the same note. Now look, we have got pages and pages and pages of dumpster fires loaded on the back of trains and collided into each other. Dumpster fire train wrecks. That's what we got going for so much of what we have ahead of us, but there is this through line, even through the darkest days, the days of the judges, the days of warring, the days of cholera, metaphorically speaking, that gives us this sense of hope. And even that name Jesse, as we work a little bit forward in the Bible, we're going to come across a prophet who talks about this whole line, this whole redemptive project being a burnout stump. It's wrecked. Nothing that's ever going to come from it. But there's this little shoot, this little image of a little tiny green stick that comes out of the burned out stump of Jesse. And that little shoot is what will produce the Messiah, this theme of something beautiful and redemptive happening against the backdrop of deepest darkness, runs all the way through the Bible. But in addition to appreciating it for the grand role that the book of Ruth plays in the grand redemptive picture and big narrative of the Bible, I think it also has to be appreciated for the tonal break we get from what we've had everywhere else. I think we also have to stop and appreciate it for getting a really good look at a woman on screen and a woman of character, for that matter, just a person of character. When you think about Ruth, obviously picture the main characters, Ruth and Boaz. When you visualize the whole thing, let's picture that awesome moment where Boaz makes the fateful decision to spread his garment over Ruth. When you think about the theme, reflect on hope born out of love and faithfulness, so much so that faithfulness. And hopefully you can just make time to read the whole thing, but if for some reason you can't, make sure to at least catch the first chapter. All right, level up on the book of Ruth. Awesome. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.